Thank you, and thank you for coming to my dissertation defense today. I'm excited to share my research on what it means to choose a home in a city that's characterized by a complex socioeconomic landscape and also a physical ecosystem that poses increasing challenges to residential mobility. The world is urbanizing fast, and already today, in most world regions, most of us live in cities. But it's the cities in Latin America, Africa, and developing Asia that will account for nearly all of the urban population growth between now and 2050. And what that means is that not only sustainable development challenges, but also global poverty is moving into cities. With the rising concentration of populations, many of these developing cities are facing increasing environmental pressures, and urban environmental hazards represent a growing development challenge. About 180 million people worldwide are exposed to urban flooding each year, and about 2 million to urban landslides. But what's important is that this environmental vulnerability is increasing not only due to climate change, but is exacerbated by poor planning and mismanaged urbanization. In fact, research by the World Resource Institute shows that the projected urban damage due to flooding in Colombia will nearly triple between 2010 and 2030, but that nearly 2/3 of that increase will be due to socioeconomic rather than climate change. In many of these cities, also economic livelihoods are vulnerable, and an increasing number of people depend on unstable or informal sources of income. In many of them, over half of the people employed outside the farming sector are employed informally. And qualitative evidence suggests that informal networks represent an important source of livelihood support and help minimize these economic risks. So my dissertation explores the relationship between the urban physical environment and the social environment, or the so-called social ecosystem. Specifically, I ask, in the context of urbanization-driven environmental risk and economic informality, what do people value most when they choose a home? What kinds of trade-offs are they willing to make in their residential location decisions, and what are their implications for planning? And lastly, is there a heterogeneity among the urban poor in terms of their residential location decisions? And if so, how can we explain it, and what are its effects? Cities in Brazil, Colombia, and other developing countries are going ahead with mass-scale interventions and projects such as these mass-scale housing programs that are these projects that are far removed from city centers, that have the potential to drastically change their urban form and also irreversibly change their local social ecosystems. In fact, there is plenty of evidence that in the past, the planning for the urban poor has rarely been economically or socially sustainable. And my dissertation is partly motivated by these past failures, and it argues that a better understanding of the social context and drivers of residential mobility can improve our economic models and eventually improve economic and environmental resource planning. So in residential location literature, there have been two main approaches to understanding how households choose among locations and how housing prices are determined. In the first approach, the market equilibrium determines the housing prices, while in the second approach, households are assumed to calculate the utility of each discrete location and then choose the one that yields the maximum utility. And in the first approach, studies have typically relied on data on revealed or actual housing choices. And I use this approach in the first paper I'll present today, in which I look at how housing choices are influenced by environmental risk. In the second approach, studies have also relied on data on stated choices and aim to elicit preferences more directly. And I use this approach in the second paper I'll present today, in which I look at how housing choices are influenced by willingness to stay close to personal networks and how these networks might mitigate vulnerability to both environmental and economic risks. Today, I will not be covering two of my other dissertation papers in depth, but I will occasionally refer to pieces of analysis from those as well. So one of the main assumptions in neoclassical economics is that people act independently based on full information when they make economic decisions. And so in the context of flood and landslide risk, or any environmental risk, this acting based on full information would mean that the differences in property values across space would reflect the differential economic losses expected as a result of these harms. But in reality, as we know, even in the US, people often lack information about risk before the hazards occur. And so therefore, they're unable to invest in mitigation measures. Similarly, various social attachments might prevent them from relocating, even if they're fully aware of risk. In addition to environmental amenities and housing space, accessibility, and especially accessibility to employment opportunities, is one of the main attributes that housing studies have examined. And so these studies typically assume that employment locations are exogenously determined, or in other words, that households choose their residential location based on a predetermined and stable workplace location, typically located in the city's central business district. But of course, in a developing city context, this notion of accessibility is likely much less relevant, given that many people are employed outside the formal economy, and then they access resources and services informally, including through their informal support networks. So there are 2 or 3 main ways in which interpersonal networks have been incorporated in these residential location studies. Firstly, some of them have considered the information provision or choice set formation role of networks. And so these studies that tend to be theoretical, they assume that when we interact with one another, it helps us refine our knowledge about the residential environment and ultimately allows us to make better housing choices. So in cities with spatially unevenly distributed environmental risk, networks might influence residential choices by providing information about the risk distribution. A second set of studies have looked at the so-called locational amenity role of networks. And so what these studies assume is that basically that people gain utility from interacting with every other human in the urban area. And so these models allow for a central endogenously determined social interaction location to which travel must incur a cost. And then a related set of studies have talked about the so-called herd behavior effect of networks, or otherwise known as network externalities. And so, for example, network externalities have been invoked to explain phenomena like the spatial clustering of ethnic communities in the United States. But in addition to these 3, we can imagine that networks might influence residential location choices because they also can lower the effective cost of living by providing access to various economically important resources. And while a number of qualitative studies have talked about the role of networks in facilitating resource flow among their members, so far, this resource access role has not been formally incorporated in quantitative location choice models. So in my dissertation, I look at this resource access role more formally. In addition to accounting for the role that networks play in providing information about housing alternatives and thereby influencing choices, including the choice to settle in environmentally precarious areas. The yellow arrows in this graph show the direction of the causal effects that I investigate in the 2 papers I'll present today, while the white one shows an effect that I analyze in my dissertation, but that I will not be covering. So in my dissertation research, I focus on Bogota, which is colored here in orange, which is a city that's facing a continuous influx of rural migrants, pervasive economic informality, and extensive environmental risk. Latin America is already by far the most urbanized developing region, and also in Colombia, 3 out of 4 people live in cities. And in the last several decades, the internal armed conflict has displaced several million people from rural to urban areas. And so these migrant inflows in Bogota have exacerbated the already high housing deficit, which today is estimated about 12%. Socioeconomic segregation, increasingly so at the microspatial scales, is a distinctive feature of Bogota's spatial and social structure. And since the mid-1990s, the city government has also applied a formal policy of territorial stratification, where as a way to plan the city, as well as to increase economic equality by cross-subsidizing public services from the upper to the lower strata residents. And the strata is based on indicators such as housing quality, overall neighborhood blight, and other urban poverty indicators. This policy has also had the effect of hindering residential mobility of the lower strata residents because it essentially creates incentives to stay in the poor areas. And as you can see in the map, both historically and today, the city's northeastern part, or the so-called central business district, concentrates the upper strata residents, while the lower strata are located in the southwestern periphery, where also many of the informal jobs are located. About a fifth of Colombians are exposed to environmental risk, and also in Bogota, environmental disasters occur frequently. About 15% of the population is exposed to flood risk, here shown in blue, and about 20% are exposed to landslide risk. And of course, as you can see by comparing this map to the previous one, the low strata and the hazardous areas overlap considerably. So for instance, in the most landslide-prone localities of the city, the share of households that are below poverty line reaches about 30%, compared to 15% for the city overall. And the risk of landslides is mostly caused by the high levels of precipitation in the city, as well as land erosion and settlement on unstable mountain slopes, while flood risk is exacerbated by the pollution of the river, as well as the increase in surface area with little or no vegetation. So since 2003, the city government has been implementing a program where it resettles thousands of informal settlements from zones of high risk and provides housing subsidies to those who have been resettled. In addition, it's also considering various other mitigation investments, such as purchase of land plots near the river to carry out controlled flooding. And so an assessment of the effect of environmental risk on the housing market and the heterogeneity of this effect is important for estimating the cost-benefit ratios of these future interventions, as well as for targeting them to where the marginal benefits might be highest. And then a comparison of the risk-related rental discounts with the actual economic losses caused by environmental hazards over time would also tell us whether the housing market is efficient at internalizing risk, or if instead housing consumers significantly underestimate risk when they choose where to live. So in the first paper I'll present today, I analyzed the effect of flood and landslide risk across Bogota's housing market, asking whether the risk is internalized in housing rents and whether the effect might be heterogeneous depending on the type of risk and the type of housing. But in addition to heterogeneity in risk valuation, we can imagine that also the information about risk across space is not even within the population and is influenced by the household's access to assistance during the housing search. And so we can imagine that networks might influence the risk exposure through either of these two channels. Firstly, if network externalities are present, or if networks have a high locational amenity role, they might influence risk exposure indirectly by basically constraining the housing search radius for households who are looking where to buy. And secondly, they might influence the risk exposure directly by providing information about the risk distribution. And so in the second part of this analysis, I look at whether the household dependence on interpersonal networks during the housing search process in any way influenced their exposure to environmental risk. In this analysis, I rely on data from the multi-purpose survey for Bogota of 2011 and combine it with additional spatial data at the neighborhood scale, such as data on whether or not any level of flood or landslide risk is present in a neighborhood. I look specifically at rental housing because the actual purchase values of most housing units were not available. And as you can see, about a third of all the units in the sample are homes, and homes are also significantly different from apartments in many other aspects, such as lower overall neighborhood quality and lower structural quality. While homes are somewhat less likely to be located in areas exposed to flooding risk, they're more likely to be located in areas exposed to landslides. To analyze the effect of environmental risk on housing rents, I implement a hedonic pricing model, which is a typical methodology in housing and environmental valuation literature. So the idea behind this revealed preference approach is that when people choose where to live, they at least implicitly choose also a level of environmental quality, including hazard risk. So then we can infer the valuation of these different housing attributes, here described by Z, by comparing the overall rents of heterogeneous housing units. And this graph shows one of the fundamental assumptions behind a hedonic pricing model which is that higher levels of positive housing attribute, for instance, housing space, would be associated with higher overall rents. But also that a marginal increase in the positive attribute would be valued higher at lower levels of that attribute, which is illustrated by the fact that this line is increasing at a decreasing rate. So then the hedonic pricing coefficients can be interpreted as the implicit prices of these different attributes. Or in other words, the implicit price tells us how much more has to be paid for housing with each additional unit of the attribute. And so in the case of environmental risk, which is classified as either the presence of risk or its absence, the implicit price would tell us how much more has to be paid for an equivalent unit of housing that is located in an area where there's no risk. So the specific model that I implement models the housing rents, which are described by lowercase y, as a function of various housing and neighborhood attributes, as well as dummy variables for flood and landslide risk. And importantly, my model accounts for the fact that housing risk, environmental risk might not only be measured with error, but it might also be correlated with other variables, such as government interventions and private investments, that also influence rents, but that we do not observe or cannot explicitly measure. In addition, I also account for spatial dependence in data. For instance, the possibility that the housing rents of a specific housing unit might be influenced by the rents of nearby units, even if those other units are quite dissimilar. So I instrument for these endogenous risk variables using actual flood risk data and actual rainfall data for the year prior to the year this housing survey was implemented. And so the idea is that basically, unlike the risk of environmental hazards, which is measured over relatively long time periods, actual hazards in a given year are certainly more randomly distributed, and therefore should not be correlated with unobserved influences on rent in the following year. And similarly, also rainfall is quite dissimilar from year to year, and therefore for a given location and a given year should be considered a random shock. At the same time, both of these instrumental variables are correlated with risk distribution and therefore are relevant as instruments. So in this graph, you can see the results of the simple OLS regression, which does not account for emitted variable bias. And you can see that location in an area exposed to landslide risk is associated with a higher rent discount and a higher implicit price. So the y-axis shows the implicit price of risk, which is negative, and the x-axis shows the two types of risk. When we actually account for the emitted variable bias or measurement error associated with risk measurement, you can see that the effect of flood risk increases significantly, even though the effect of landslide risk doesn't increase by much. And so this suggests that the emitted variable bias is a significant issue only in the case of flood risk, but not landslide risk. In fact, the effect of flood risk now more than doubles and exceeds the effect of landslide risk. And the implicit price of flood risk is about $50 per month, or nearly, or over a quarter of the mean rent in these areas. When we analyze the housing type separately, you can see that the effect is quite heterogeneous depending on the type of risk and the type of housing. Implicit price of risk is by far the highest in the case of flood risk exposed homes at about $70 per month, or nearly 12% of the mean household income in these risk exposed areas. So next, I combine the spatial data on risk distribution with survey data that documents the recent relocations to the city by both renters and owners. And the specific survey question asks, do those who have relocated within the last 3 years, if they did so with the help of locally based family or friends networks? And as this graph shows, the vast majority of both groups moved to the city with the help of networks, but the share was much higher among renters than among owners. So then using binomial logistic regression, I model whether the dependence on networks in this settling in the city in any way increase their likelihood of settling in areas exposed to either flood or landslide risk, while also controlling for a range of other socioeconomic variables, such as the household size, income, and gender of the household head. And as you can see in this graph, dependence on networks did lower the odds of settling in areas exposed to landslide risk for both groups, but it also increased the renters' odds of settling in areas exposed to the risk of flooding. And so I don't find much evidence in the survey to suggest that this is due to, that this effect on risk exposure is due to information provision by networks. Instead, I think it is much more about the fact that these locally based networks that helped in the settling process are themselves former migrants that are also themselves living in the flood-prone areas. So especially if housing costs outside these flood-prone areas are high, then these former migrants will increase the likelihood of the new migrants settling in these same areas, even if they're fully aware of risk. So to conclude with this paper, I hope to contribute to the environmental risk valuation literature by examining the effect of risk specifically in a developing city context, and by explicitly accounting for the emitted variable bias associated with risk designation. I found that the effect of flood and landslide risk is at least partially internalized in housing rents, and that the effect of flood risk is much higher when we account for emitted variable bias. I also found that the compensation required to rent in these areas in the form of a rental discount is quite heterogeneous depending on the type of risk and the type of housing. Although I wasn't able to conclude whether this heterogeneity in valuation might in fact be due to the fact to variable knowledge about risk by these different housing consumers. And lastly, I found that networks shaped the vast majority of new arrivals to the city, and more importantly, that these social relationships shaped the human-environmental interrelationship. And so while networks help limit the choice set to exclude the housing units in the most landslide-prone areas, they also increase the likelihood of settling in flood-prone areas. And so it seems that this is less a story about information provision by networks and more about the strong migrant network externalities and the spatial clustering of former migrants that tend to perpetuate existing residential settlement and risk exposure patterns. And while my analysis quantified the implicit price of renting in these areas, more research is required to analyze what the cost of avoiding risk might be for these same households. And so while it might be well possible to mitigate existing flooding risk, it is less likely in the case of high levels of landslide risk. So then in that case, the calculation of willingness to pay by these tenants to avoid risk should also take into account the likely non-trivial costs they would incur of having to relocate to another neighborhood altogether, especially if their livelihoods are dependent on spatially embedded network ties. So in the second paper I'll present today, I more explicitly look at the role of networks in improving livelihood security of the urban poor and the importance of network proximity in their residential location choices. Geographically, I focus on the city's two most flood-prone localities, Bosa and Kennedy, that are home to about 2 million people, or about a fifth of the city's population. In this paper, I focus on the stated as opposed to revealed choices by implementing a discrete choice field experiment that I combine with detailed survey data that maps their social networks and the resources accessible through them. In this paper, I ask, how much do low-income individuals value living near their extended family networks? What trade-offs are they willing to make between proximity to networks and these more traditional housing qualities like housing space and accessibility to the central city? And lastly, are the preferences for living near extended family networks heterogeneous? And if so, can we explain it by variation in the resources that these people are able to access through the networks, and by whether or not these networks have served as safety nets in times of crises? And so my initial interviews with city planners and public officials in charge of housing planning suggested that the importance of networks for low-income individuals in particular is a major influence and constraint on their willingness to relocate, and also influences the uptake of formal housing projects, even if they're of better objective physical quality. So to answer my research questions, I worked with a team of 4 enumerators that I contacted through the University of Los Andes in Bogota. We surveyed 300 individuals in the 2 localities, and the survey questionnaire we implemented asked questions about their own socioeconomic background, as well as asked them to name up to 10 individuals they consider to be part of their network, as well as follow-up questions about each of these individuals, such as their residential location and socioeconomic characteristics. The second part of this questionnaire also mapped the various resources they were able to access through these networks. So where the resources included personal advice, various skills, educational resources, as well as vertical linkages. For instance, an example of a vertical linkage would be knowing someone who can provide a good job recommendation. And then finally, the survey also asked whether the person had relied on network contacts in a crisis situation and to describe the specific crisis. Our respondents represented the three lowest of the 6 socioeconomic strata in the city, here shown in the upper left corner in red, orange, and yellow. The majority of them came from households that make less than $700 a month. Two-thirds of the respondents were employed, but only a third in jobs that have a formal written contract. over 70% of all the contacts they named were relatives, and most of them were relatives outside the immediate household. In contrast, less than a half of all the respondents named anybody who wasn't their relative. And those who did tended to be younger, have a university degree, and to be born in Bogota. So the respondents were able to access about 60% of all the resources we had listed, and about a third specifically from extended family. About a half had relied on their networks in a crisis situation, and about a fourth specifically had relied on extended family members. And when asked to describe the specific crisis, these crises range from both personal to economic or material emergencies. For instance, for 10 respondents, the crisis involved having to relocate to another home due to their home being flooded. The networks of these respondents tended to be very spatially concentrated, and the majority of their contacts lived in the same exact neighborhood as themselves. As you can see in the map on the left, the family ties were particularly concentrated in the 2 survey localities. I next analyzed the specific resources they were able to access through the networks. And as you can see here, less than a fourth of all the vertical linkages, here colored in red, were accessible through family contacts, but nearly a half were accessible through non-family contacts, even though family contacts represented a much larger share of the overall network. On the other hand, the types of resources that family contacts were best able to provide were in the categories of practical help and personal advice, for instance, helping to move to another home. In fact, I found that most of the respondents were able to access these types of resources only from their relatives. And in another paper of this dissertation, I found that networks disproportionately composed of relatives were better at overall resource access as well, even when controlling for such network qualities as spatial and socioeconomic diversity. And then finally, the survey we implemented included this stated preference choice experiment, where each person was faced with 6 different choice situations similar to this one, where each hypothetical housing alternative was described by 6 different attributes, where the first 5 are quite common in residential location choice models. And the 6th one is quite unique to this one. And then after the completion of the choice experiment, they were asked which 2 of these attributes they prioritized most when making choices. So this graph shows the response to this follow-up question, and it shows that the housing tenure was by far the most important among the housing attributes that were presented. But then also, accessibility to the extended family networks was prioritized more than accessibility in the more traditional sense, or to the part of town where most of the formal opportunities are located. So about 20% of all the respondents said that accessibility to the extended family networks was one of the 2 most important attributes in the housing choice. So those who said they prioritized accessibility to networks differed in several ways. Firstly, a much larger share of their overall network was represented not only by extended family generally, but also by extended family living nearby. The extended family networks also had particularly high resource access value, even though their overall networks were somewhat poorer in resources. So in other words, the extended family networks were then represented a disproportionately important access point to resources. And lastly, they were also much more likely to have relied on extended family in a crisis situation, or experienced the so-called stress buffering effect. And then lastly, those who said that prioritized proximity to networks also differed along several socioeconomic dimensions. They tended to be younger, female, coming from poor households, and to be employed in less stable jobs. And importantly, it also seemed that proximity to extended family was seen as a strategy for coping with threats to physical safety, because those who said they prioritized it also tended to live in neighborhoods that they considered unsafe or that are prone to flooding. So then I used this experimental data to impose some structure on the decision making and to not analyze the specific quantitative trade-offs that people are willing to make between these different attributes. And I do that using a conditional logistic regression, a conditional logic model, in which the probability of choosing a specific alternative is expressed as a function of the different attribute levels. So this graph shows that on average, people prefer living near their extended family networks and are willing to pay more for it than for accessibility to the central business district. And as might be expected, accessibility to the central business district was particularly important for those who are currently formally employed, given that CBD usually concentrates kinds of jobs like informal sectors, like public services and finance. So an increase in travel time from the housing unit to the central business district by half an hour in public transit would imply about $150 of welfare loss per month for those who are currently formally employed, while the loss would be about $40 for those who are not currently formally employed. And similarly, there's some heterogeneity in the preference for proximity to extended family. So it seems that the stress buffering of networks, stress buffering effective networks, or their role as safety nets in times of crises, significantly strengthened the preference for living in an extended family. So among those who had never relied on extended family in a crisis, the welfare loss would be about $100 per month, compared to about $170 for those who have. And while being able to access various resources through the extended family networks didn't seem to significantly affect the preference for living near the networks, I found that the preference was significantly influenced by ability to access childcare assistance from extended family. So in other words, those respondents who have children and were able to access childcare assistance from their extended family had a significantly stronger preference for living near compared to those who were not able to access such assistance. So to conclude with the stated reference choice experiment, I found that the surveyed low-income individuals prefer living near their extended family networks, and that they value it more highly than accessibility in the traditional sense, or to the part of town where most formal opportunities are located. I also found that those who had relied on extended family in a crisis situation had a much stronger preference for living near extended family, as did those who were able to access childcare assistance from extended family. So this research suggests that proximity to extended family networks is an important vocational amenity that people value highly and that cannot always be compensated for improvements in other housing attributes. It also suggests that proximity to extended family networks is valued at least partly because of their role in mitigating vulnerability to both economic and environmental risks. Planning and redevelopment in developing cities has often been done with a critical reflection on the individual's livelihood sources and the spatial embeddedness of their social ecosystems. Regarding the environmental and resource economics and urban sociology, my dissertation aimed to inform policy in the intersection of environmental and socioeconomic vulnerability by identifying not only the physical but also the social, locational amenities that people value when choosing a home, and by explaining heterogeneity in residential location choices, by also accounting for the role that networks play in shaping choice sets and acting as access points to resources. Choosing a home in a complex physical and socioeconomic landscape means making trade-offs between different types of risk, different types of livelihood support, and different types of accessibility. And as I've learned through my dissertation research, social interdependence guides economic decision-making to a large extent and influences choices, including choices to locate to environmentally precarious areas and areas that are far removed from formal opportunities. At the same time, the empirical evidence I presented today also showed that interpersonal networks contribute significantly to resilience to both economic and environmental risks. The strong preference for living near interpersonal support networks, especially family networks, is important to consider in urban policies related to urban renewal and population resettlement, such as resettlement from environmentally precarious areas, to have the least possible disruption to people's livelihoods and quality of life. And it is also important to consider in defining of future affordable housing communities, so that they're able to accommodate extended households, or at least provide good connectivity to those parts of town where their residents are likely to relocate. So my hope is that by providing evidence on the interaction between Bogota's physical environment and social environment, I've contributed to a debate that will inform its future environmental and economic resource planning. Before I let you ask me questions, I'd like to thank my own support network. I'll start with Dennis and Aliza. Who are always by my side and who help put things in perspective. I'd like to thank my family back home in Latvia. With me here today, who've been supporting me with, in my 20 plus years of education, and have seen me move at Jersey progressively west and have stopped me. I'd like to thank my much bigger adopted Turkish family, who especially in the last year have helped so much with taking care of Aliza. In fact, this slide should be called the International Network of Aliza Babysitter. I'd like to thank Dario Daldo from the World Resource Institute, who took me under his wing the first year after E-IPER and basically introduced me to everybody in Bogota and convinced me to do my research. And I'd like to thank my team of field enumerators led by Professor Vasquez, who did an incredible job. I'd like to thank the E-IPER family, especially Jen. And Ben in particular, who without whom many of us wouldn't get this far. I'd like to thank my funders. I'd like to thank my funders, the Cox family, the Stanford Interdisciplinary Director Scholarship for providing generous funding these last 5 years, as well as the Urban Studies undergraduate department at the Brandner Geospatial Center, providing outreach opportunities. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my committee, Jim, Dan, Len, and Dan from Berkeley, who each have contributed uniquely to this presentation coming together. And of course, I'd like to thank Steve for sharing the class. Thank
you. Questions, Brian?
Aiga, thanks for your presentation. It was great. Did the size of the extended family, or who was in the extended family, matter? Like, did it matter if it was your parents versus your cousins, or like younger, old generations?
So it didn't matter so much for the resource access, but I find that the composition of the family matters a lot for other things. Like, for instance, I found in another paper that, which was interesting, that the networks of individuals that I surveyed tended to, those who had the highest education and socioeconomic status within the network, or who contributed most to resource access through the network, were the adult children of the respondents who had been able to gain better education than their parents. And so, in other words, the resource access was enhanced by sort of educational mobility within the family. And the better educational achievement of children, not so much by the fact that these individuals were meeting better educated people outside the family. So that was nothing that I found interesting. First of all, that there's so much heterogeneity within the family. But you'll see that when you go to Bogota, that even in the poorest areas, there's huge heterogeneity in terms of educational achievements, even income. So it's hard to predict, there's not a perfect prediction between economic characteristics and neighborhood characteristics.
So I know you'll probably be tackling similar questions in your work at the World Bank, but I was wondering if you had more specific recommendations for Bogota as it moves forward with developing new housing stock for other urban communities.
These papers that I presented didn't really show that. The paper that I didn't present kind of highlighted that the proximity or accessibility to the central city or the more formal area of the city is quite important for meeting people that are different, for accessing resources and things like that. And so, one of the kind of obvious points of intervention in the city would be creating more rental housing in the central city through urban infill. And actually, the former mayor has pushed for that quite a lot. Instead of building these mass-scale housing developments in the urban periphery for urban development, he's tried to find a lot of opportunities to create housing space for the poor in the areas that are accessible. And I think that's one way of going forward. And then another way, which is also something that his former mayor pursued, is seeing every development intervention in the city as a climate resilience intervention. That's another specific.
Do you think that your estimate of the price discount for being exposed to flood and landslide risk would have been larger or smaller if you looked at home buyers rather than renters?
So it's hard to predict, but my impression is that it would be lower just because of how important is housing ownership in the city and how much people are willing to forego to just be able to own. So my impression is that the discount might be lower because of that. It might also be less variable depending on, let's say it floods one year but doesn't flood the next year. The rental value will be more vulnerable to this.
Do you see any movement for construction materials, especially the home base we use that are especially prone to landslide, right? Do you see any movement for more robust construction materials that regardless of the location can
Yeah, so I think, as I said, I'm not a structural engineer, but I think there definitely are many places where you can improve, especially in the flood-prone areas. But a lot of the areas that are exposed to the highest levels of landslide risk are located on, basically the houses are built on former prairies, like sandstone prairies, and so they're just not suitable for construction. But I think only less than 1% of all the people in the city are actually living in these kind of really highly exposed areas.
Like, how generalizable do you think your findings are to other low-income areas?
I think it's hard to generalize, but I think that the research context is not so unique. I mean, it has so many similarities with other cities that have high rates of urbanization and informality. So I think the relevance of informal networks for livelihood support is generalizable. Just a matter of socio-spatial segregation of the city of the particular city that will matter too. But I think the role of networks in livelihood security is quite, you could generalize definitely to Latin America where informality is always very high.
Do you worry sometimes that with the strong drive to be connected to one social network and with trying to get close enough to economic resources, that the ability of folks like the former mayor of Bogota, or imagine even an economist working for the World Bank, to control this might be very limited, that they might read your dissertation and say, looks like this is really hard to manipulate because people will continue to move into vulnerable areas as they trade off with practices.
So in the past, the government hasn't really controlled it either. They've kind of seen not if it's in very vulnerable areas, but definitely in areas that are on the very periphery of the city where there's no infrastructure. And so what's happened in the past is that they just let it happen, seen as a cheaper way to build housing for the poor. So they allow the houses to just incrementally build to the extent that they can afford it over time, and then eventually they come in with infrastructure, utilities, and formalize it. And it's always been seen as a more realistic way to provide housing for the poor. So there's no, even in the language, they don't use the word illegal, kind of avoided to not have the stigma for those types of housing supply sources.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.